Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the real state of the American labor market is far worse than what is being discussed? And what if the very agency meant to give us the truth is completely dark at the worst possible moment? To truly understand what's happening in the American economy right now, we first have to grapple with a massive problem. We are navigating one of the most significant informational voids in recent history. A government shutdown, paralyzing core federal agencies, has halted the timely release of the official Bureau of Labor Statistics BLS jobs report. This report, a cornerstone of economic analysis and policy, was due on the first Friday of the month, but its absence has left a gaping hole in the nation's understanding of its own labor health. The BLS, tasked with this crucial data collection, is effectively offline. This cessation of official data dissemination could not have come at a worse time. As concerns mount over inflation, consumer stability, and corporate health, the very metrics needed to assess these threats are unavailable. This lack of official data has forced economists, analysts, and most critically the Federal Reserve to operate in a thick fog. Policymakers are now flying blind, a deeply precarious position when making decisions that impact national and global markets. In the absence of the gold standard BLS numbers, a forced reliance has shifted entirely to a patchwork of private sector reports. Data from firms such as Challenger, Gray and Christmas, ADP, and Relio Labs, while valuable, are not designed to replace the comprehensive scope of the government's survey. They often measure different things. ADP, for instance, tracks payrolls, while Challenger tracks announced layoffs, not necessarily immediate ones. This creates a conflicting, fragmented, and often confusing mosaic of the labor market, one that is difficult to interpret with high confidence, yet remains the only available guide. Now, let's look at the most jarring piece of this new puzzle, which comes from the Challenger Gray and Christmas report for October 2025. The findings from this report are not merely weak, they are alarming. US-based employers announced a staggering 153,074 job cuts during the month. This figure on its own would be cause for significant concern, but its context reveals the true scale of the distress. This number represents a massive 175% spike when compared to the approximately 56,000 cuts announced in October of 2024. The acceleration from the immediately preceding month is just as severe, marking a 183% surge from the 54,640 cuts seen in September of 2025. To fully grasp the magnitude of this figure, historical context is essential. This data marks the worst October for job cuts since the year 2003. Perhaps even more sobering, the number of layoffs announced exceeds the levels seen in October of 2008, a month synonymous with the onset of the great financial crisis. This comparison is not made lightly. It suggests that the pressures building on corporate America have reached a critical boiling point. What makes this spike particularly ominous is its timing. The fourth quarter of the calendar year is historically and culturally a period of employment stability. Companies conscious of morale and optics typically try to avoid executing large-scale layoffs during the holiday season, which encompasses both Thanksgiving and Christmas. The fact that businesses are pushing through such massive cuts at this specific time speaks volumes about the severity of their financial predicament. It signals that their distress is no longer a manageable issue to be deferred until the new year. It is an acute crisis demanding immediate and drastic action. This willingness to bypass traditional seasonal norms suggests an undercurrent of extreme corporate distress. This single month of catastrophic data is not an isolated event, but rather the culmination of a deeply troubling year. The year-to-date data for the first 10 months of 2025 reveals a relentless wave of workforce reductions. In this period, American employers have announced a total of 199,500 job cuts. This means that with 2 months still left in the year, the 1 million layoff mark has already been the job cuts explosion, worse than 2008 breached. This figure is 65% higher than the total from the same 10-month period in 20124 and has already soundly surpassed the entire 12-month total for all of 204. The trend is not only negative, but it is also accelerating. Adding to this grim outlook, the Challenger report noted that more companies announced plans for future layoffs this October, with 450 firms signaling such intentions compared to 400 firms at the same time last year. The pain is not evenly distributed, but its breadth is concerning. Several key industries are being hit particularly hard. The technology sector, once the engine of job growth, saw 33,281 cuts announced in October. This is a shocking jump from the 5,639 cuts seen just 1 month prior in September, indicating a rapid and severe correction. The warehousing industry, a darling of the pandemic-era logistics boom, is experiencing a brutal reversal of fortune. It has seen 90,418 job cuts year to date, a staggering 378% increase year over year. This is not merely a normalization, it is a collapse. Industry giants like UPS have attributed these cuts directly to a sharp and painful drop in business volume and revenue, dispelling any notion that this is solely a story of AI-driven efficiency. It is a story of demand evaporation. Similarly, the retail sector is flashing major red flags about the health of the American consumer, with 88,664 cuts year to date, representing a 145% year-over-year increase. The industry is signaling that consumer demand has weakened far more considerably than official data has previously suggested. The services sector, the backbone of the modern economy, is also feeling the strain, shedding 63,580 jobs year to date, a 62% increase from the prior year. This is not a story of small, struggling businesses failing. The list of companies announcing major reductions reads like a who's who of corporate America. United Parcel Service (UPS) has shed 34,000 operational jobs. Amazon, another logistics and tech behemoth, is cutting 14,000 positions. Target is reducing its corporate roles by 1,800, and Paramount Skydance has laid off 1,000 workers. Even historically stable brands known for strong employment are trimming their salaried workforces, including Starbucks, Delta Airlines, and CarMax. This wave of layoffs carries a secondary insidious effect. Reports from the ground indicate that those workers who are laid off are now finding it significantly harder to secure new roles quickly. This frictional unemployment is lengthening, suggesting that the no vacancy signs are becoming widespread. As the pool of unemployed grows and the duration of unemployment lengthens, it creates a feedback loop of depressed spending, and further economic contraction, ensuring that the labor market will likely loosen further in the months to come. Now, while the layoff announcements from Challenger painted a clear and unambiguous picture of corporate contraction, the data related to hiring created a mixed bag that, upon closer inspection, offered no real comfort. This conflicting data landscape only serves to deepen the sense of uncertainty. Yet all indicators, even the seemingly positive ones, point toward profound weakness. The ADP report for October provided the month's primary shock to analysts, but not in the way many expected. The report showed that private payrolls had unexpectedly risen by 42,000. This was a significant surprise, as the consensus expectation was for net job losses, especially following September's revised report showing a loss of 29,000 jobs. However, this positive number was immediately met with deep skepticism. A gain of 42,000 is barely positive in the context of the vast American labor market. It is not meaningfully different from a small negative number and remains squarely within the danger zone. It suggests an economy that is, at best, stalling at a near zero growth rate, a condition that cannot absorb new entrants into the labor force, let alone employ the hundreds of thousands being laid off. Any lingering optimism from the ADP report was extinguished by data from Revilio Labs. This particular data series had been a source of optimism for markets in the previous month, but its October release and subsequent revisions revealed a trend that is unequivocally negative. The first major blow was the revision to its own September data. The initial celebrated estimate of a 60,000 job gain was unceremoniously cut nearly in half, revised down to just 33,000. This pattern of high initial prints, followed by large negative revisions, has become a hallmark of the current economy, mirroring a similar and much criticized trend in the official BLS establishment survey. Before its release, the Waterfall moment, why labor hoarding is over, was halted. It suggests that initial data collection is failing to capture the weakness, which only becomes apparent in subsequent reporting. The new data for October from Relio confirmed this dire trend. The estimate showed 9,000 net job losses. While not a catastrophic number in isolation, its direction is critical. The firm's own data, with its pattern of dramatic downward revisions, has effectively drawn a straight line pointing directly toward accelerating job losses. This weakness was further confirmed by data on seasonal hiring. Typically, October is a month where retailers and logistics companies staff up significantly for the holiday shopping season. According to private data, these seasonal hiring plans are at their worst levels since the year 2012. This is a devastating sign. It shows that businesses have zero confidence in the forthcoming holiday season. They are anticipating a weak consumer and are refusing to invest in a seasonal workforce, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of a bleak fourth quarter. So that brings us to the why. Why is this sudden and severe deterioration happening all at once? The answer seems to be rooted in a toxic combination of macroeconomic factors that have finally come to a head. The labor market appears to be transitioning through the phases of a concept known as the flat beverage curve, a model describing how labor markets cool. The first phase, which characterized much of the post-pandemic recovery, was no hiring, no firing. In this phase, companies buoyed by stimulus, recovery, optimism, and a fear of labor shortages were hoarding workers even as the economy began to slow. They held on to staff they didn't necessarily need, fearing they wouldn't be able to rehire them when the imminent rebound arrived. The economy has now decisively transitioned into the second phase. No hiring, some firing. This is the current state. The no hiring part is reflected in the weak Revelio and ADP data and the collapse in seasonal hiring. The some firing is the 153,000 cuts reported by Challenger. Businesses have given up on the promised rebound and are beginning to shed the excess staff they had hoarded. The terrifying part of this model is the next expected phase. No hiring, a lot of firing. This is the destination the economy is currently pointed toward. And history shows this final transition can happen very, very quickly. It is the waterfall moment where the dam of labor hoarding breaks completely. The stated reasons for the job cuts, as cited by the corporations themselves, align perfectly with this theory. The primary reason given was cost cutting. This is a catch-all, but it is driven by more specific pressures. These include softening consumer spending, a euphemism for consumers pulling back, and weaker corporate spending as businesses cancel projects and reduce investment. Persistent rising costs, namely inflation, are another core driver. Businesses are being squeezed from both ends. Their costs for materials, labor, and capital interest rates remain high, while their ability to pass these costs onto a weakening consumer has evaporated. This margin compression forces them to cut the only variable cost they have left, their workforce. Finally, firms are citing structural changes, including the rapid adoption of AI and a final painful correction from the pandemic hiring boom. The concrete proof of this perfect storm is found in the October ISM Services PMI. This report provides a chilling explanation for why firms are being forced to cut labor. While the price index remains stubbornly high, hitting 70, indicating high input costs. The backlog index, which measures the amount of future already booked work, collapsed to 40.8. This is the lowest level for service backlogs since the year 2009. The implication is devastating. The pipeline of work that has kept service sector employees busy is drying up at an astonishing rate. With high costs, no new work coming in, and no backlogs to work through, the employment index of the report remains solidly under 50, the threshold for contraction. This is the mechanism of the mass layoff. Costs are up, work is gone, and labor must be cut. It is critical to understand that these macroeconomic drivers, the cost cutting, the demand destruction, and the evaporation of backlogs, did not emerge from a vacuum. They are, in fact, the intended and long delayed consequences of the Federal Reserve's own aggressive monetary policy campaign. For the better part of 2 years, the central bank engaged in one of the fastest rate hiking cycles in modern history, raising the cost of capital from effectively zero to a deeply restrictive territory. Even with the recent single cut in October, the Fed funds rate at 4% remains a world away from the environment that businesses and consumers had become accustomed to. We are now witnessing in real time the brutal impact of those long and variable lags that economists so often discuss. This policy shock has directly manufactured the corporate distress we now see. The cost-cutting imperative, for instance, is not a new management fad. It is an act of survival. An entire generation of corporations had been built on the foundation of 0% interest rates, binging on cheap debt to fund everything from speculative hiring sprees and aggressive expansion to massive stock buybacks. The consumer is broken, record delinquencies emerge. That era is definitively over. Now, a maturity wall is fast approaching where billions in old, cheap corporate debt must be refinanced at rates that are 400, 500, or more basis points higher. This creates a black hole in corporate cash flow, and the most immediate and effective way to fill that hole is through mass layoffs. The 153,000 cuts in October are not a proactive strategy. They are a panicked defensive reaction to this new expensive cost of capital. Simultaneously, this same policy has systematically suffocated the American consumer, who is the lifeblood of the service economy. The weakening consumer is a direct creation of the Fed. Revolving credit card interest rates tied directly to the Fed's benchmark have soared to record highs, in many cases exceeding 20%. This acts as a crushing non-legislated tax on households, diverting billions of dollars from discretionary spending to debt service. Furthermore, the policy's impact on the mortgage market has effectively frozen the housing industry. The wealth effect that homeowners felt as their equity soared has vanished, replaced by a locked-in effect where no one can afford to sell their home and forfeit a 3% mortgage, and almost no one can afford to buy at current rates. This is precisely how monetary policy is supposed to work. It is designed to destroy demand to bring down inflation. The catastrophic ISM backlog index, at its lowest point since 2009, is not a bug in the system. It is the central feature of the Fed's strategy. The problem is that the soft landing narrative, which promised a gentle cooling, appears to have been a fantasy. The Fed was tightening policy until something broke, and the data from October strongly suggests that the dam has finally burst. The labor hoarding has ended, and the corporate capitulation has begun. The pain that was once confined to interest rate sensitive sectors like housing and tech has now gone fully mainstream, triggering the waterfall of job losses we are witnessing. This abstract storm in the labor market is now making landfall directly on the American household, and the collateral damage is visible in plunging consumer confidence and a sharp rise in financial distress. The University of Michigan's preliminary November report on consumer sentiment was a disaster. The headline sentiment index plunged to 50.3, its lowest reading since the inflation panic days of June 2022. The current condition subindex, which measures how consumers feel about their finances, right now plunged to 52.3, a record low. The report leaves no ambiguity as to the cause. The primary drivers cited by consumers themselves were the anxiety-inducing government shutdown, the relentless pressure of persistent inflation, and the now undeniable wave of corporate layoffs. This anxiety is translating directly into fear. A terrifying 71% of all consumers surveyed, more than 7 out of every 10 Americans, now state that they expect unemployment to rise in the coming year. This share has more than doubled from just 1 year ago, showing a rapid and widespread loss of faith in job security. This fear is not irrational. It is a reflection of a financial squeeze that is already happening. The most recent report from the New York Federal Reserve on consumer delinquencies, which covers the third quarter, confirms that households were already in deep trouble before the October layoff spike even occurred. This data is the smoking gun that proves the financial stress on Main Street is not new. The transition rate for auto loans into serious delinquency rose to nearly 3%. This is the highest rate seen since the first quarter of 2010 and is on par with the levels seen in the third quarter of 2008. For credit cards, the serious delinquency rate hit its highest mark since the first quarter of 2011. And for student loans, the report noted a huge surge in serious delinquencies, with a record high transition rate as pandemic era forbearances end. This widespread inability to pay bills before the worst of the layoffs confirms that the financial health of the consumer was already compromised, setting the stage for a severe downturn as job losses now remove their primary source of income. All of this, the collapsing labor market, the persistent inflation, and the panicked consumer, places the Federal Reserve in an impossible bind. The central bank is now trapped by its own, the Fed's impossible bind: inflation versus unemployment, dual mandate with its two primary objectives now in war, direct and violent conflict with one another. On one hand, the Fed is tasked with price stability. Inflation, its primary enemy, remains at 3%. This is still far above the Fed's 2% target, and recent data suggests the rate of inflation has actually been accelerating, not cooling. This component of the mandate screams for higher, or at least restrictive, interest rates. On the other hand, the Fed is responsible for maximum employment. The data from Challenger Revilio and the ISM PMI shows inarguable proof that the labor market is not just cooling, it is clearly weakening and deteriorating significantly. This component of the mandate screams for cutting interest rates to support the economy and the job market. This conflict has paralyzed the central bank. Fed Chair Jerome Powell, in recent comments, has attempted to thread the needle by describing the labor market as experiencing only a very gradual cooling. This statement has been met with widespread incredulity, as it appears to stand in stark, irreconcilable contradiction to the much harsher reality detailed by the private sector data and the record low consumer sentiment. Powell has used the fog from the government shutdown as a public justification for the Fed to take a more cautionary approach, effectively giving them an excuse to pause and see which fire, inflation or unemployment, burns hotter. This impossible trade-off has reportedly sparked significant internal disagreement within the Federal Reserve. Two opposing camps have emerged, each championing one side of the dual mandate. Federal Reserve Governor Cook, representing the dovish camp, has argued that the Fed must prioritize the rapidly weakening labor market. This argument calls for cutting interest rates to boost jobs and stave off a recession, even if it comes at the cost of reigniting inflation. In the opposite corner, Federal Reserve President Goolsbee, representing the hawkish camp, has argued that the fight against inflation is paramount and not yet won. This argument calls for not cutting interest rates and perhaps even holding them higher for longer to ensure inflation is fully defeated. This path, however, comes at the acknowledged cost of inflicting more pain on the labor market and likely pushing the economy into a recession. Caught between these two choices, the Federal Reserve appears frozen. However, the market has placed its bet. According to the CME FedWatch tool, which tracks market probabilities for interest rate moves, the market is largely grabbing to the inflationary threat and focusing on the labor market collapse. The next FOMC meeting is scheduled for December 10th, with the current Fed funds rate at 4%. As of now, the market is pricing in a 68.7% probability of a 0.25% or 1/4% rate cut. This expectation is not based on new data, but on the Fed's own prior guidance. The Fed's September projections, the SCP, had penciled in a rate cut for December. The market's current bet is that the weak, mixed, and chaotic private sector data was not strong enough to deter the Fed from this pre-planned path. The prevailing belief is that the Federal Reserve, when faced with the choice, will ultimately be forced to capitulate to the weakening labor market and cut rates regardless of the consequences for inflation.